All rise, veuillez vous lever. Please be seated. Veuillez vous asseoir.
Well, all evidence points to Mr. Garcia as the next speaker.
Yes, good afternoon, Your Honors. But just for one brief instant, just to inform the Chamber that we will not be continuing for the moment with the Ngaissona individual criminal responsibility, and we will be continuing with my presentation. Mr. Van der Puye will be very likely addressing that at the conclusion stage. Thank you very much.
Please continue.
And for the record, Your Honors, Maître Nyang is not present with us. The rest of the prosecution remains unchanged. One extra person, Leila Hassius, as well from the office, who's present with us in the back. Alors, Monsieur le Président,
Mr. President, Your Honors, I intend to address you briefly on the elements of evidence that the prosecution considers relevant when it comes to the individual criminal responsibility of Mr. Yekatom. I do not obviously intend, and I don't have the time to revisit all the elements, but I will mainly focus on the most relevant points. And as to the other elements of evidence, we will revert to the written conclusions or briefs that were already filed to the Chamber. It is clear, Mr. President, from the entirety of the evidence that it is by following the criminal orders of Mr. Yekatom that his elements committed crimes against humanity and war crimes, for which he is charged in the document containing the charges. Basically, Your Honors, a lot of evidence has been submitted to you. My learned colleague Van der Puye has broached most of them, but if we look at the evidence relating to Mr. Yekatom, we see that he acted through the intermediary of his group, his anti-Balaka group, which happened to be a hierarchical organization with a military structure, with organized hierarchical power structures. And the evidence will show, Mr. President, or the evidence has shown that he had undisputed power over the group. Several witnesses have addressed this matter. The crimes, Mr. President, were committed pursuant to the implementation of a common plan, which in itself was also criminal in that it violently targeted individuals of Muslim faith who lived in the area under his control. As a matter of fact, Mr. President, Your Honors, when you look at the evidence, it becomes obvious, apart from the hostility, the violent hostility against Muslims, which was the trademark, so to speak, of the Anti-Balaka group, what we observe is that Mr. Yekatom used and harnessed that anti-Muslim hostility to implement his joint plan, his common plan. The criminal acts were committed, therefore, pursuant to this common plan. When we look at the entirety of the evidence, the common plan, Mr. Yekatom obviously held the most important position of authority within the anti-Balaka group. And in order to ensure that this plan was implemented with the members of his group, targeting members of the anti-Balaka group in the southwest, rather, and in Bangi and on the PK9 road, as well as in Bangi. This is, in fact, the area where the common plan we have been talking about took place. What was Mr. Yekatom's contribution to this plan? It emerges from the evidence that his contribution was as follows. Firstly, Mr. Yekatom himself is the one who created his group, the anti-Balaka group. Mr. Van der Pruy has talked about it. We have listened to some video recordings this morning to that effect. Other video recordings are also in evidence, pointing to the fact that Mr. Yekatom himself says that he is the one who created the anti-Balaka group. He structured it, he organized it, the anti-Balaka group, in the bush, and it was done pursuant to a military-style hierarchy. We must recall that Mr. Yekatom himself is a career soldier with experience in that area. So what he did, Mr. President, is that he positioned himself as the leader of the anti-Balaka group, an unchallenged leader of the group. That is what he used to ensure that his authority was not contested, and he did so by using violence against his elements. So, aggression, gunfires, and killings were the hallmark of this authority. Nothing, Mr. President, and we need to underscore this, that from the evidence, nothing whatsoever was done within his group without Mr. Yekatom's authorization. We have talked about, and it is important to mention this charge, as well as the incident which my colleague will talk to you about this morning, or tomorrow morning, rather, this afternoon or tomorrow. Nothing was done without his authorization because his authority over the group was unchallenged. The evidence will also point to the fact that his authority was unopposed, and in that capacity, he was the only person who could decide on the fate of people's lives. One prosecution witness, transcript 155, French version, page 38, line 27, page 39, line 5, prosecution summed it up very well, saying, if Mr. Yekatom said you will be released, you will be released. But if Mr. Yekatom said you will be killed, then you would be killed. This is it all, Mr. President, about the authority and uncontested power of Mr. Yekatom within his anti-Balaka group. He used that authority to command, to order his elements to commit the crimes for which he now appears before your chamber. Mr. President, Your Honors, the evidence also shows that while Mr. Yekatom was creating, organizing, and structuring his group along military lines, he brought together within his group individuals, men and women, and then he also recruited some children later on. All these people had one thing in common, and this is important, and we can see this clearly from the contemporaneous videos which were taken in December and January. And they talk about it themselves, or rather the videos speak to this directly, that these people whom he recruited had a thirst for vengeance against the Seleka, who, by the way, Mr. President, were sort of treated with violence and hostility and were grouped together with Muslims as well. This violence, Mr. President, and hostility we see in the videos, and the reason for the violence is that those of the Muslim faith were supporters of the Seleka or accomplices of the Seleka who had done them so much damage. These were the people who were part of Mr. Yekatom's group, and they were of the state of mind I have just described against Muslims. Mr. President, I can already tell you that this is something that they did not even bother to dissimulate. We have looked at the videos, and you can see from the videos and even from the written statements before you that they made public statements about killing Muslims. They were not ashamed of it. They were proud of it publicly. And they did so, talking about it in public in front of others who were brandishing machetes and so on and so forth. And everything in this regard was done in public. Why, Mr. President? Why? Because this was not only tolerated within Mr. Yekatom's group, it was actually promoted or encouraged. If you take the time to look at the videos again, you will see that basically this is what one comes to conclude about. They were not bothered by this publicity. Mr. President, apart from creating, structuring, and organizing his anti-Balaka group, he also planned, prepared, and executed the attack on Bangi with his anti-Balaka group. The chamber has heard evidence in this connection from prosecution witnesses in private session, and I do not intend to revisit those points because the chamber is well informed. In any event, what emerges is that Mr. Yekatom led the attack on the Boeing market, which, it must be said, Mr. President, was not a legitimate military target. It was a market where traders did their business. They had spent the night there protecting the little of their property that was still remaining. They killed those traders. Some fled, without which more people would have been killed. These people are traders, and I don't need to repeat this, but you can see from the defense's written submissions that they identified them as traders who were in their market, in their shops, protecting their items. These were not military targets. These were not people who were in any way whatsoever involved in any acts of hostility. Maître Pierre Belbenoit would revisit this question and will delve into some of the points raised by the defense in their brief. So, this is what the elements did, and they did so pursuant to Mr. Yekatom's orders, the orders that he gave on the eve of the attack on Bangi. The chamber heard witnesses, and one of the main prosecution witnesses said that an order had been given by Mr. Yekatom the eve of the attack to his elements. Not only was the order given, but also the target was to target civilian Muslims, not only Muslims, but men. And these, Mr. President, I must say, were not military targets nor persons who were involved in the hostilities, none of them. So, because his power and his authority were unchallenged, the elements obeyed his orders to the letter, including the destruction of the mosque in Boeing. Mr. President, I cannot go into further details because evidence was given in this regard in private session. But the chamber also heard evidence that Mr. Yekatom gave similar orders during the training of his elements as they prepared for the attack. He ordered them to attack civilians of Muslim faith, but that's not it. That's not all, Mr. President. The orders were repeated, and you have two important witnesses in this case who corroborate each other when they speak about Mr. Yekatom's desire to attack Muslim civilians. You have witness 1873, transcript 171, page 31, from lines 5 to 19, in which Mr. Yekatom repeated to his elements while they were on the Bangi road the following. He asked them to kill Muslims who were to be found in the area under their control. So basically, Mr. President, the same criminal orders were issued, and these orders were heeded to the letter. In a nutshell, when we look at the evidence on record, particularly prosecution evidence, the evidence is such as to exclude any reasonable doubt because, Mr. President, the ongoing and permanent orders about which you have testimony, permanent orders, Mr. President, were the orders that caused Mr. Yekatom's group and its members to kill Muslim civilian traders during the attack on Boeing and on Catin on the 5th of December in Bangi. These standing orders are the same orders that caused his elements to detain civilians. 7 persons, including 3 Muslims, 3 women, were abducted and tortured, and one of them was killed. These acts were done pursuant to the orders which the elements also obeyed in killing the mayor in Bangi. These were orders of violence, Mr. President, orders that engendered fear in the population and caused violence within the group, and which led to forcible transfers and deportation of hundreds and thousands of persons, Mr. President, who were to be found in any areas where Mr. Yekatom and his group went by. Bangi, PK5, Bangi, and in these areas, people had to leave their communities. They were uprooted, Mr. President, and we heard evidence that some only left with whatever they had on them by way of clothing. They abandoned their property, their homes, their belongings. Everything was abandoned in Bangi, and this evidence is before you, Mr. President. So, Mr. President, these orders contributed to the implementation of the common plan, which led to the persecution of persons of the Muslim faith. Mr. Yekatom recruited children of less than 15 years old, and they were under his authority. And it must be said again that nothing happened without his knowledge, without his authority, without his authorization. And so this is known from the evidence. Turning to the mens rea, Mr. President, of Mr. Yekatom, when we look at the criminal nature of his orders and the criminal nature of the plan, of the common plan, the only conclusion you can come to is that Mr. Yekatom acted voluntarily and wanted to ensure that the objective elements of the crime that he wanted to pursue were committed by his elements. At the very least, Mr. President, you have enough evidence to come to the conclusion, mindful of the context, of hostility against the Muslims, violent hostility, one must say. This is how I choose to refer to it. We can only come to the conclusion that Mr. Yekatom must have known that the acts committed by his elements were going to occur in the normal course of events. Let me turn again to the common plan and mention just a few items which the chamber is already fully conversant with. I emphasize only a few. One, you have the criminal orders of Mr. Yekatom. I've already addressed that. I don't intend to go back to it. But this is crucial because it speaks to the very determination whether there was a joint criminal plan in place. He gave orders for civilians to be killed, Muslim civilians to be killed. The evidence also points to the fact that on the 5th of December and thereafter, Mr. Yekatom's orders were respected to the letter. His elements committed crimes, and this speaks to the existence of the common plan. P1339 and P3839 testified in this regard, Mr. President. We can take the crimes and murders committed by members of the anti-Balaka group belonging to Mr. Yekatom, for example, in Bangi, in Yamrawa, and in Mbaiki. We see that acts of torture were committed, and all of these elements point to the existence of such a common plan with an intent to violently target people of Muslim faith in his zone of control. We also have video recordings, Mr. President, Your Honors, and my learned colleague, Mr. Van der Poel, talked to you about them already, and I mentioned them early on in my presentation as well. These are video recordings which speak for themselves. We don't need to say any more. But what they do is that they give you upfront opportunity to see the hallmark of this anti-Muslim violence, which characterized Mr. Yekatom's group at the time of the crimes. And this went from the lowest ranks of the hierarchy to the very highest ranks. There was no distinction made between the Seleka and civilians of Muslim faith. Before I play the first recording, we can see at CAR OTP 20650436, and for the interpreters, the transcript is CAR OTP 2107153.9, page 154, lines 1 to 18. We will see here that one of the generals of Mr. Yekatom, the second deputy, who would later on become his deputy, Mr. Bena, talks about the possibility of a genocide.
Non. Le premier. Alors voici la vidéo.
Here comes the video. Christians are suffering a lot, you can see. It's difficult to find food. Why these gentlemen here? They are fleeing the Seleka. It's because of the Seleka. You can see Chadians, Sudanese, Turaburas, Janjaweed. You can see for yourself. They have to go back to their home. Here is the Central Africa. This is not Chad. Idris Deby cannot command us here. El Bashir cannot give us orders here. This is the Central African Republic. If he does not resign in 3 days, then we will carry out a genocide in the CAR. This is very brief. My decision is very clear. Now, Mr. President, this is a video recording which the chamber already listened to before, but which tells the details of the story about the murderous intentions of someone who was of high command levels in Mr. Yekatom's group. He's the one who would become his right-hand person later on. It speaks volumes about the murderous intentions of Mr. Yekatom himself as well. I have a second video for you. It is a video in which we see another aspect of another element of Mr. Yekatom's group. He was in charge of training of recruits at the Nyamrawa school base. He was a commander in charge of that activity, and his name is Max Maidana. In the video, he explains what I was talking about before, the very disconcerting and cold nature in which they intend to use the weapons in their possession against Muslim individuals.
C'est quoi? C'est quoi cette arme?
What weapon is that? This weapon is like an anti-aggression weapon. It is to target Muslims who are we launch it towards Muslims who are in their homes so that they might come out. It's like tear gas. And so we snuff them out and then we kill them. And we kill even little children because we have suffered too much. But we are soldiers.
Monsieur le Président,
Mr. President, the video recording is very clear. There is no possible misinterpretation of what Mr. Maidana was saying, whether he was talking about Seleka or Muslims. He talked about children. And that is why, at the very beginning of my presentation, I have repeatedly said that this violence or this anti-Muslim perception was extremely violent, and this is the type of thing that Mr. Yekatom used for his elements to attack the market in Boeing and Qatar, targeting civilians who were not military targets. That's not all, Mr. President. I know that the chamber has already watched a number of videos, but there is also more that we can talk about by watching videos that talk about people slitting other people's necks and slaughtering, and talking about this publicly, shamelessly, in public. And these all speak to the levels of violence and the threats that were targeted against persons of Muslim faith. This characterizes Mr. Yekatom's group. I want to portray, or rather display, video CAR 026 to 5172. Sorry, the interpreters missed that reference, but Mr. President, here we're dealing basically with some of the most important prosecution witnesses, and this speaks to their credibility on this specific point, but also to the relevance and reliability of their testimony in a very broad sense. At transcript 152, edited version, page 16, lines 2 to 5, we have a witness who talks about this state of mind, or this mindset that characterized Mr. Yekatom's group while they were in the bush. The witness testified that those who joined the groups were led by a spirit of violence. He goes on to say that even the chiefs who commanded the troops were motivated or guided by the same spirit of vengeance. Witness P1839. Also, I can talk about this witness here. Is a very important witness who provided reliable evidence to the chamber, and the chamber put some questions to the witness in relation to the mindset of members of Mr. Yekatom's anti-Balaka group. With your leave, I would like to quote. The chamber asked the following in a bid to find out how the leaders of the Yekatom group spoke about Muslims. P1839 said, and I'm quoting him, they were enemy number one, Mr. President. Enemy number one. And that is exactly what we see in the videos. And it explains, Mr. President, why murders were committed at the Boeing market. It explains why so many things happened, including the Yamwara incident, and it speaks to the reasons for people being arrested, detained, tortured, and killed. It also explains why members of Mr. Yekatom's group killed Mr. Jido Saleh, second deputy to the mayor, who courageously decided to remain in the town, whereas he could have left, but he paid with his own blood. It explains, Mr. President, the very reliability of witness 1839. When the chamber asked witness 1839 why it is that the leaders thought that Muslims were enemy number one, P1839 sheds a lot more light when he answers as follows. It was tooth for a tooth, an eye for an eye, because of all what they had been subjected to by the Seleka. Because when the Seleka entered the Central African Republic, some Christians had to pay for it. So in our minds, in our heads, it was the same thing. And that's what happened, Mr. President. Mr. Yekatom's group attacked civilians of Muslim faith because, as P1839 put it, it was a tooth for a tooth and an eye for an eye. Mr. President, I do not intend to call for a private session, but we also have an excerpt from the testimony of this witness, transcript 170, edited version, page 35, from lines 1 to 9. It would take about 13 seconds or so, but I just simply want to refer you to a small excerpt of this testimony, which is extremely important when you look or you consider what the witness testified to in relation to the state of mind of members of Yekatom's group when it comes to persons of Muslim faith.
Si la Chambre le permet, je pourrais peut-être...
With the leave of the chamber, I would take 1 minute, please, to just go in private session for 1 minute.
Well, very shortly, really, yeah. And it should not become a regular thing. Okay.
We are back in open session, Mr. President.
Alors, Monsieur le Président, en ce qui concerne...
As regards the contribution, Mr. Van der Boy has already talked about this. The contribution of Yekatom, I've also talked about this as I tackled the topics in my submissions, my oral submissions. The contribution of Mr. Yekatom, independently speaking, or even jointly, was that he had control over the crimes. Why? Because clearly he had set up and organized his Antipalika group according to his own desires. He has set it up, he gathered them together, and he created the mindset that they had in a public way. He commanded, Your Honours, through fear and violence. We have said this in our submissions in a greater detail. He was a member of FACA. He set up a military hierarchy of the kind and placed himself at the head of it. And this despite the fact, Your Honours, that he only had the rank of Master Corporal within the FACA. But this didn't have much significance, Your Honour, because a witness said Mr. Yekatom was a warlord. And I quote, "No one could take his place. It was impossible." This is 201, page 36, line 2 to 19. So, be a general, be a captain, it was Mr. Yekatom who was in charge, no one else. No one could disobey Mr. Yekatom. No one would dare to disobey him within the Antipalika, because if they did, they risked death, 1718-6 stated this. Car OTP 20580200 on page 205, paragraph 28, where he confirms, and this is very important, Your Honor, because he remembers that it doesn't matter who you were, if you dared to disobey Mr. Yekatom, and he added this, and this is extremely important as far as we are concerned, that he would have never survived if he himself had disobeyed Mr. Yekatom. Not to mention, just to mention the fear that they felt and the violence on his part, which we mentioned, which is described more details in our written submissions. We heard the witness of P. 1839, who talked about the authority of Mr. Yekatom, saying that it was only Yekatom could decide not only on the life or death of a person, a captive. Transcript 71, page 27, line 10, and page 28, line 18. As regards these contributions of Mr. Yekatom, he also, and Your Honor, he was not only, everybody was forced to respect the military hierarchy under his authority, which is undisputed, and also his chain of commandment. And through this chain of command and military hierarchy, Yekatom could give his orders, and this way he would be sure that his commands would be carried out to the letter. And this is what becomes clear in all the evidence. Mr. Yekatom, in the same sense, made discipline reign within his group by violence or the fear of violence. The proof of this shows that he didn't use punishment to his own elements if they didn't obey his orders, if they did not show loyalty. And some elements have borne witness to that. P. 1637 confirms that Yekatom was responsible for discipline within the group, and said that Mr. Yekatom himself punished the commander by beating him with a stick. What is important to remember here is that this evidence in transcript 51, page 38, page 44, line 3 to 28, saying that there was no appeal and his orders had to be carried out. It was only he who would be in charge of discipline. Yekatom equipped his elements with ammunition and munition, which he did before the 5th of December. And finally, Your Honor, which I've already mentioned, which is extremely important, that it was Mr. Yekatom who, at the head of his group, prepared his elements and threatened his elements and led the elements during the attack of PK9 up to Bangi. He gave them criminal orders. It is Mr. Yekatom, and his contributions were essential for these orders to be carried out. You also have the evidence, Your Honor, that there were children less than 15 years of age within his group. Given his authority, which is undisputed, and the fact that some of these children were manning the blockades and were managed by the anti-Balaka group, those children were under the age of 15. Nothing could be done without his authority. So, Your Honours, members of the court, as leader of the group, of the anti-Balaga group, Mr. Yekatom had the responsibility to take measures to prevent any violations of international humanitarian law by their subordinates. Evidence shows that Mr. Yekatom, in fact, did the opposite. Completely the opposite. Now I will try, Your Honours, members of the court, to give the floor to Mr. Pierre Belnois Alvich, who will talk about the events that took place in Bangi.
Thank you, Mr. Garcia.
Monsieur le Président,
Mr. President, Your Honors, the evidence adduced during this trial proves beyond a reasonable doubt that Yekatom and his group, then composed of about 1,500 elements, including some FACA, participated in the attack on Bangi on the 5th of December 2013, which was carried out in a coordinated manner by different anti-Balaka groups. In accordance with the strategy laid out by the anti-Balaka leaders involved, including de facto coordinator of anti-Balaka operations, Maximo Kum, Yekatom and his groups specifically attacked Boeing and Katen sectors in the southwest of Bangi with the objective of advancing towards PK5, which was the Muslim neighborhood of the capital. The Bangi attack was carried out by the anti-Balaka with the aim to take control of the city, to oust Jotodia and then take power. But its purpose was also to attack Muslim civilian population whose members were also considered to be Seleka. Video recorded statement by the anti-Balaka leaders at the time of the December 5th attack, referenced in our concluding statements, unambiguously depict the clear intention of these persons to attack and kill Muslims, including statements by Angelo and Chocola, who led some of the fighters during the attack. Shortly after the 5th of December, Sylvestre Yaguzu, an anti-Balaka spokesperson, made no secret of this collective criminal intent when he declared, and I quote, "We are going to carry out the massacre. Let him resign to save the lives of the Central African peoples." So, for the Chamber's references, these declarations or statements of Angelo and Chocola bear the ERN CAROTP 20490141, translation CAROTP 20741958 rather, and those of Yaguzu bear the ERN CAROTP 20655468, translation CAROTP 21222303. During the attack, the anti-Balaka targeted members of the civilian population who were not involved in the hostilities. The vast majority of Muslim civilians in the neighborhoods attacked by the anti-Balaka had no alternative in the face of their violence but to flee en masse in a hurry towards PK5 in particular in order to seek refuge. The bodies of victims, men and women, some bearing traces of machete blows or burnt, were transported to the central mosque in the Muslim neighborhood at PK5. Mr. President, Your Honors, in the context of his group's participation in the attack on Bangi on 5 December 2013 on Boeing and Katen, Yekatom directed an attack against the Muslim civilian population of these areas. And this is a war crime referred to under Article 8.2 of the statute. Under his authority and in execution of his criminal orders, his elements killed at least 8 Muslim civilians who were not directly involved in the hostilities. They attacked the mosque in Boeing and forced Muslims in Boeing and Katen to flee en masse for their lives. This characterizes the crime against humanity of deportation or forced transfer, and the war crime of forced displacement. These crimes were committed for religious, national, or ethnic reasons, targeting the victims because they were Muslims or Arabs and depriving them of certain fundamental rights, including persecution. On a preliminary point, the prosecution observes that the defense of Yekatom attempts in paragraph 355 to 362 of its closing brief to establish a cordon sanitaire between Yekatom and his group on the one hand, and the anti-Balaka on the other, by resorting to a fiction articulated around an obtuse acronym, the RFA-CPP. It argues that Yekatom's group, far from being the anti-Balaka movement, was in fact a small group of Faka who intervened in the attack only at the request of Captain Gremangu, and that the latter, who had actually been trained in international humanitarian law, observed the principle of distinction during the attack. Mr. President, Your Honors, this fiction does not stand up to scrutiny of the evidence, especially that provided by a number of witnesses within the anti-Balaka at the time and who were involved in the preparations of the attack. It does not stand up against the telephone communications data on file, which shows, among others, that at least 22 telephone contacts between a telephone number assigned to Yekatom and a telephone number assigned to Mokom between November 26, 2013 and December 4, 2013. Thus, at a very high frequency in a few days, during which the strategy for the attack was put in place and implemented. These contacts between Yekatom and Mokom are analyzed in paragraphs 54 of our final brief. To be clear, therefore, Yekatom and his group participated in the direct and indirect connection with the anti-Balaka leaders of the 5 December attack, including Mokom. As my colleague, Mr. Ngaissona, pointed out, Yekatom and his men were part of the anti-Balaka movement at that time. With regard to defense's allegation at paragraph 589 of its closing brief, according to which elements of the accused's group were imbued with the principles of international law and observed the principle of distinction between combatants and civilians, this does not hold up to the evidence relating to the crimes and the numerous video recordings of statements made by them following the attack of December 5, which tend to portray their intention to kill Muslims, to drive them out, and in so doing, admitting to having killed them. I will return to this point. First of all, Yekatom is being prosecuted for intentionally directing an attack against the Muslim civilian population of Boeing and Qatar as part of the December 5 attack, a war crime charged under count 1. In this regard, the chamber heard during the trial that Yekatom had assembled his elements the day before the attack and gave them criminal orders. In giving them his instructions for this operation, he told them to attack not only the Seleka, but also members of the Muslim civilian population, mainly men. The evidence is inherently credible and corroborated by circumstantial evidence that leaves no room for a reasonable doubt. My colleague, Mr. Ngaissona, has already mentioned the existence of similar instructions from Yekatom and his lieutenants pertaining to training, and then later on, when the accused group was advancing along the PK9 Bangi axis. Most significantly, Your Honors, many video recordings contemporaneous with the attack show that the leaders of the group, including those closest to Yekatom, as well as the rank-and-file elements, openly proclaimed their violent hatred of Muslims and their desire to drive them out, to kill them, and claiming to having slaughtered some without fear of being reprimanded by the leaders present. Bena, whom would later become Yekatom's deputy, threatened to commit a genocide. These recordings not only show their desire to attack the Muslim population, not only show that that desire was shared by all elements of the group, but also at all levels, up to the top, and that such sentiments and criminal acts were furthermore encouraged and supported by the leaders of the group. Mr. Garcia spelled out the highly structured nature of Mr. Yekatom's group and the discipline in place. Yekatom's elements, including his deputies, would obviously not have made such statements if the accused did not share their views and sentiments and conduct. The references of the relevant videos are mentioned in our final submissions. Video CAROTP 2065-3172 is particularly significant on this point. We will play it. It is short. I would like to invite the interpreters to follow the translation, which is at CAROTP 2118-5654 at the same time. We must kill this Steleka. We will get Jotodia. We will kill him. We will kill all of them. He has to go. He has to go. I am Central African. Bozize, KNK.
Moi je suis de section, hein? Laisse-moi d'être con, ok? C'est moi d'être con. Depuis on a fait presque 3 mois, 4 mois dans la forêt. On veut seulement.
We have spent a lot of time in the bush. All we want is for Central Africans to live in peace. We are here to intervene for the Central African people to return to peace. My name is Corporal Magdana Max. I am a soldier. We are here. We don't want Jotodia to remain in power. We want him to leave the Central African Republic. We don't want to see any Muslims. We are all soldiers. We are here for our country. We are fighting for our country.
Je signale que plusieurs des individus.
Let me point out that several individuals whom we saw, including the young man with a white shirt, who can be seen at timestamp 000026, is an individual wearing a red hoodie and a front pocket, also visible at 00026, and Max Maidana with a red T-shirt bearing the words "Run" can be seen in another video, CAROTP 2065-3208, in the presence of Yekatom, who addresses them and gives them further instructions. These 3 individuals and others identified on other videos can be seen at 000206, 000211, 000022 timestamps on this second video, and they are dressed in exactly the same way, at the same location, in the same base, and apparently at the same time. In parentheses, someone can be heard in the video referring to Bozize and KNK. This is evidence that relates to the contemporaneous period of the December 5 attack, which Yekatom and his group did indeed share, and in relation, one might say, to the return to constitutional order. Finally, the legal consideration of this point of commission by Yekatom under Article 8.2 of the statute, at paragraph 585 of its conclusions, the defense asserts that this crime can only be characterized that it is a primary object of
or individual civilians not taking direct part in hostilities. Mais le fait que Yekatom.
However, Yekatom led the attack against Seleka, but this does not prevent nor exclude the fact that he directed an attack against the Muslim civilian population in Boeing and Ketang. The defense relies on a case law that does not support its argument. Mr. President, Your Honors, let me now turn to the point of murder, the murder of at least 8 civilians by Yekatom's group in Boeing and Katin in connection with the attack of 5 December 2013, crimes prosecuted under charges 2 and 3. The evidence demonstrates beyond reasonable evidence that Yekatom's evidence deliberately killed at least 7 Muslim traders at the Boeing market who were not directly involved in the hostilities. On the day of the attack, at around 6 a.m., Yekatom and at least 600 of elements of his group took up positions in front of the shops of these traders. While the latter had spent the night there to protect their goods because they were worried about the tension in the capital city, Yekatom gave orders for the assault by firing to the air, and the elements then fired. Some of the shopkeepers who had weapons for their protection tried to defend themselves in self-defense, but they were shot. Muslim shopkeepers were wounded by gunfire, and a number of them managed to flee. In our final brief, we clearly demonstrate that the factual circumstances were clear and that these victims were indeed traders and were not directly involved in the hostilities. Yekatom was aware of this because he was on the scene and he launched the attack against the merchants, which, it must be said, fall under crimes under Article 8.2 of the statute. In paragraphs 387 and 2393 of their submissions, the defense develops a number of arguments. First, they allege at paragraph 387 of their closing brief that Yekatom and his troops or his elements attacked the market based on the testimony of witnesses who testified about this incident, but also based on anti-Balaka officials who testified about the strategy adopted for the 5th of December attack, including the fact that Mr. Yekatom and his group were in charge of attacking Boeing. Yekatom and his group, as of the 5th of December, actually took up base in the Yamrawa school in the same sector. A video recorded under number CAR OTP 20654500 confirms that Yekatom's group took control of the market area as part of the attack and has the value of circumstantial evidence. It shows Yekatom on the phone after the attack explaining clearly to Seleka elements as follows. They came with their outfits, they are in the bases, and they came all the way to the market, to the Boeing market as well. So we fell back a bit. I'm referring here to video transcript CAR D2900613335.
Secondly, the Yekatom defense put forward arguments that the Seleka were directly taking part in paragraph 391 of its final submissions. It notes, and I quote,
evidence of multiple Boeing residents as to the traders' possession and use of firearms, their membership of the Seleka, and their material assistance in Seleka missions aimed at cracking down, abducting and killing ex-FACA. Au regard des sources.
As regards the sources of the numerous witnesses, which you can see in paragraph 394, footnote 1303 to 1306, the numerous witnesses, in fact, limit themselves to just 2 witnesses, P0884 and D294011, whose evidence on this point is devoid of probative value. P0884 relates to hearsay and apparently confuses Hassan with Bishara. The statements of D294011 was unable to testify under the supervision of the chamber and to be cross-examined, so are devoid of credibility. In his own admissions, this witness was not able to travel to the market since an unspecified date in 2013 because of health problems. and D294011 gives no details as to his sources of information. On this point, generally, I would like to draw the Chamber's attention to the points developed in transcript T154, page 50, lines 15 to 19, and page 51, lines 18 to 13. The prosecution is surprised that defense should rely on these two witnesses whose credibility is weak, rather than on its own witness, D294013, who lived close to the market and who said that he frequently went to the market. This is in transcript T277, page 8, line 2. D294013 stated that although the Muslim traders had visits from people who spoke Arabic, there was nothing to suggest that they were Seleka. I refer to transcript T277, page 19, line 4 to 24. If Seleka had been based at the market, or if Hassan or other traders had been Seleka, then D294013 would have said so. The defense did not, and they did not do so in the question and examination in chief in context to your open questions. Finally, in paragraph 391 of the submissions, the defense again argues, referring to witness, that Yekatom may have wanted to attack the Muslim traders in the market first, in order to warn that his elements ran the risk of later being attacked from the rear as they advanced towards PK5. This line of defense is equally unconvincing. Firstly, this argument is conjectural. Secondly, in any case, the fact that certain Muslim shopkeepers had weapons for their protection did not make them legitimate military targets under the law of armed conflict. In reality, Yekatom, who shared the same hatred of Muslims as the member of his group, and who had already given general instructions to attack the Muslim civilian population the day before, did not grapple with the principle of distinction. These shopkeepers were Muslims. That was enough for him to take the decision to eliminate them. Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the court, after attacking the market, Yekatom and some of his elements continued their attack in Katin. The evidence shows beyond any reasonable doubt that members of the group killed at least one Muslim civilian who was not taking direct part in the hostilities, in carrying out the criminal orders which Yekatom had given the day before the attack. P1528 testified that while he was at home in Katin, he heard shouting, "It's an Arab," for someone calling for help. When he looked through a hole in the wall of his compound after the shouting had stopped, and driven by curiosity, or probably by fear, to see what was happening, you can logically visualize this, he saw 4 individuals who he identified as anti-Balaka, wearing grigri, armbands. One of them was armed with a Kalashnikov and the other 3 with machetes. Before this chamber, that witness said he had seen members of the population near the anti-Balaka encouraging them to kill Muslims. He saw the body of the victim later that day as he was leaving his home by car. She was drowning or bathed in her blood. This evidence is credible. The testimony of P1528 is consistent, especially as it is corroborated by the evidence in the case file, which shows that the members of the Yekatom group did indeed want to kill Muslims during the period of the attack, and that Yekatom and some of his elements were indeed in Katin in the morning of the 5th of December, as it appears from the video recording of a conversation involving Yekatom and Kiapex. For the Chamber's reference, this is document CAR OTP 2065-0726. The fact that the victim was a civilian not taking a direct part in the hostilities is clear from the fact, as recounted by P1528, who reported hearing people shouting, "It's an Arab," and therefore not, "It's a Seleka," and people encouraging the killing of Muslims. Furthermore, P1528 did not report hearing any shots, but he stated that the anti-Balaka beat and killed the victim. This appears in paragraph 31 of his statement, CAR OTP 20480757 at 0762, and in the French transcript T178, page 29, line 14 to 15. This shows that the persons did not carry a firearm. With regard to this murder, defense put forward arguments which are not sufficiently convincing. In particular, it asserts in paragraph 384 of its final submissions and in footnote 1279 that the 4 individuals identified by P1528 cannot be members of Yekatom's group because 3 of them were carrying machetes, and that Yekatom, interviewed a few days after the attack, stated, and I quote, We are not anti-Balaka, are we? Come on, you haven't seen anyone with machetes here." The Chamber will refer to the multiple testimonies and documentary evidence establishing that the majority of the members of the Yekatom group were civilians and did not possess firearms. The video, CAR OTP 20653172, which I played earlier, shows members of the accused group with machetes. I now move on to the attack on the Boeing Mosque, which is count 6. The evidence demonstrates beyond any reasonable doubt that in the early hours of the morning of the 5th of December 2013, certain elements of the Yekatom group attacked Boeing's only mosque, known as the Nur al-Vagin, firing a rocket at the building and attempting to set it alight with a little petrol, partially damaging it. Members of the civilian population continued by destroying it, removing the roof and the bricks from the wall from which it was made, in order to reuse them for building purposes. The evidence established that this attack on the mosque had been carried out in execution of general orders given the previous day by Yekatom, and that the individual who fired the rocket would not have done so without such an order being given to him by the accused. With your leave, Your Honor, I would like to go into closed session for about 5 minutes to discuss certain aspects of the evidence which I do not want to show in public.
Private session, although I said we are not very happy to go to private session. You know, if you don't mention any identifying matters, we could also have it in open session.
Very well. We will try our best.
You know, mentioning all the references in you know, on the record is something you can refer to your closing brief and things like that, because it's also for the listeners and everything, perhaps also for defense later on. It gets a bit cumbersome. It's not no criticism, but when you say, you know, this is. And you have these 8 digits, and then you say, and then the translation is another 10 digits and things like that. I think that's not necessary, because we know what's on the record, and we assume, I hope so, rightfully so, that you have it also in your closing brief. Thank you.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Your Honor. Your Honor, members of the court, contrary to what the defense maintained in its final submissions, the testimony of the witness is credible and consistent, and sometimes the reading of the defense is erroneous. Firstly, the defense argument in paragraph 363 to 365 of its final submission, which compares the testimony of this to witness 2475, is not convincing. The fact that the two witnesses have different versions of the same events does not ipso facto affect the credibility of each of them. To be clear, the prosecution is not relying on P2475. Furthermore, the testimony is credible, as explained in paragraph 589 of our final submissions. There is no doubt that this witness was part of the accused group. There's no doubt on that. The information he provided, including the information on the attack of Bangi, and in particular of the use of the racket by a certain individual to attack the mosque, is corroborated by testimonies and documentary evidence. The nature of the attack on the market and the mosque, as described by this witness, is fully consistent with the conduct of Yekatom and his group during the relevant period, as reported by the witness who were members of the group, by witnesses who were victims of the group's abuses, and as shown in particular by videos as regards anti-Muslim remarks made by members of the group. Secondly, the defense alleges intrinsic contradictions in this testimony as regards the circumstances of the attack on the mosques, which do not exist. First, in paragraph 413 of its submission, and I quote,
This individual stated that RFA CPP elements were not involved in the destruction of the mosque. Pour soutenir qu'il
in order to support that he later changed the version. But this allegation is incorrect. The defense referred to transcript T152, page 71, line 1 to 23, page 7212, noting that the witness had said in Sangha, Afa a mosquée, which in its view excluded the person speaking, and that the interpretation in French was on a détruit le mosque, we have destroyed the mosque, should be understood in the same way. But nowhere in his testimonies did this individual say to himself that he physically attacked the mosque, but that he had been with elements that had attacked and damaged part of it. So therefore there is no contradiction. Next, defense tries to explore in paragraph 413 the confusion between the initial attack of the mosque, which the witness explained was carried out by the elements of the group, and two, the subsequent destruction of the mosque by the population. The testimony in question is intrinsically consistent. From the outset, he insisted that the mosque had been attacked and partially damaged by the anti-Balaka, but that it had been destroyed, i.e., dismantled, demolished by the population in an opportunistic way. This witness said he was surprised when he and the other elements were subsequently withdrawing on the 5th of December to see that the population had begun to demolish the building. This gradual destruction of the mosques by the population over several days is corroborated by prosecution and defense witnesses, as set out in paragraph 592 of the final writings. This explanation by the question attests to its credibility. And two final points briefly on the attack of the Boeing Mosque. Firstly, in paragraph 415 of its submissions, defense distorts the evidence of the expert witness P2193, who, when analyzing a satellite image of the 8th of December 2013, showing, and I quote,
around the mosque did not appear to be damaged, unlike other areas he analyzed, where burnt patches of grass were visible. Selon la défense,
according to the defense, this contradicts the testimony of the relevant witness. This is not the case. Defense neglects to point out that this 2193 explained this by saying, and I quote,
will burn easier than a wet tree. Ceci figure au transcrit T0.
In the transcript T019, page 49, line 15 to 17. Lastly, the defense stated that D294011 and D294013 indicated they had not seen any traces of burning on the mosque when they saw members of the population removing metal sheets from it. I'd like to point out that P2193 confirmed traces of fire damage on the basis of analyzed satellite images. Secondly, the fact that the witnesses did not see any traces of burning does not affect the credibility of the evidence since, as reported by P1339, the population began destroying the mosque on the day of the attack. And it is apparent that D294011 and D294013 did not see members of the population removing metal sheets later, when the destruction was continuing, as explained in paragraph 591. Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the court, I'm now going to deal with the crimes of deportation and forcible transport and forced displacement, prosecuted under counts 4 and 5. The evidence established beyond reasonable doubt that the violence perpetrated by the Yekatom group on the 5th of December 2013 and subsequently while he was based at the Yamwara school in Boeing forced members of the Muslim civilian population to flee en masse, in particular from the Muslim neighborhood of PK5. There, they found themselves with a large number of other displaced Muslims in Bangi coming from the provinces, from localities where the anti-Balaka were also attacking the Muslim population. They lived in appalling conditions, in dire conditions, whilst PK5 was surrounded by the anti-Balaka, and to leave was risking being killed. Many of them were then taken under military escort to the north of the country, or to neighboring countries, including Chad and Cameroon. Defense argues that the flight of the Muslim civilian population from Boeing and Katan may have been the result of the violence by the Seleka or the Christian population, rather than being attributable to the actions of the anti-Balaka. These arguments do not stand up to the evidence. Firstly, the relevant witness, including D295014, linked the departure of this population to the anti-Balaka exactions in the area of the 5th of December. The evidence shows that the murders of the Muslim traders in the market rapidly became known and terrorized the Muslim population, as testified by 2682, P1528, and D29514. Particularly, the Yekatom elements wanted to attack the Muslims, kill them, and drive them out, as shown by the many contemporary videos which have already been quoted. This is actually what happened on the 5th of December in carrying out the Yekatom's criminals' order through the crimes they committed. Faced with the onslaught of more than 1,500 Yekatom elements in Boeing, where they were based and where they continued their atrocities, no Muslim civilian could choose to remain in that location without risking his life or her life and that of their family. Your Honor, members of the court, I'd like to conclude by emphasizing the obvious nature, character of these crimes. They were committed against the victims because they were Muslims or Arabs for religious, national, or ethnic reasons. On this point, I would simply refer to our conclusions. I will now give the floor to my colleague Sylvie Wakshom, who will talk about crimes committed by the anti-Balaka in Bosangoa, starting with the attack on the town of the 5th of December 2013.
Thank you. We give now the floor to Ms. Wakshom. And since we started, let's say, 10 minutes later today, I think, Ms. Wakshom, you can continue, let's say, another 15 or 20 minutes maximum from now on, before we finish for today.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Let's say 3:45.
Mr. President, Your Honors, I will be presenting on the charge related to the 5th of December 2013 attack on Bosangoa, particularly count 30 to 35 and 37 to 42. The evidence established beyond reasonable doubt that on the afternoon of 5th December 2013, a group of anti-Balaka fighters trained in Gobere attacked the Muslim civilian population of Bosangoa, killing at least 18 civilians. The timing was no coincidence. As explained by my colleague, it was carefully coordinated by MOCOM from Zongo to follow the early attack on Bangi that same day. The evidence before your honors shows that the attack on the Muslim population of Bosangoa was intentional, and that none of the 18 Muslim civilians that were killed by the anti-Balaka, including 3 women, were taking direct part in hostilities. Given their function in the Muslim community of Bosangoa, P2200 and P2049 were able to observe the dead body, identify some of them, and participate in their burial. They even provide the name of some victims that they could remember. Your Honor have seen the photograph of a Muslim victim of the 5th December attack on Bosangoa provided by P2049. It depicts several cops all appearing to be wearing civilian clothes covered with sheets. Among the 18 victims of the attack were 4 members of the local Muslim family killed as they were trying to seek shelter at the Imam's house. The evidence before your honor shows that the anti-Balaka who attacked Bosangoa shot Khadija Ajaro, Abdel Abakar, and his younger brother Atahi, and they also slit the throat of Kursi Mahamat, also known as Abdel Rahim. You have heard this from P2462 and P2657, who witnessed the attack. They heard the gunshot fired by the anti-Balaka and saw the dead body of the 4 family members. 3 other witnesses corroborate the identity of the 4 victims. Usman Abakar and his mother, both members of the Pearl family, were also among the 18 victims of the anti-Balaka's attack. You have heard from P1577, who saw the victims just moments before they were killed, that Abakar was injured from previous anti-Balaka attacks. For this reason, he could not flee with the other to the École de la Liberté. P1577 was told by survivors of the attack that the anti-Balaka killed Abakar and his mother, who had stayed at the Imam's house to take care of her wounded son. Both of their throats had been slit. Another victim of the 5th December attack is a Muslim taxi driver known as C17. He was killed at the École de la Liberté. You have heard from P2453, who witnessed the attack and described how the anti-Balaka came very close to the school, shooting in his direction and killing C17 and a peacekeeper. P2453's testimony is corroborated by P2049 and P1577. Your Honors, the fact that none of these 18 victims took part in any act of war is irrefutable, uncredible, and reliable evidence in the record. Your Honor may recall P2453's evidence that many of them were found dead in the Imam's house because they had not managed to flee to the École de la Liberté on time. Your Honor also heard from P2453, P2462, and P2657 that the 4 members of the local family did not own arms, were not engaged in combat at the time of their death, and none of them were associated with the Seleka. In fact, the 4 victims were running away when the anti-Balaka chased and killed them. The defense alternative narrative regarding Abdel Harim bearing arms and arming people prior to the 5th December is not able to cast reasonable doubts. The defense narrative is based on uncorroborated assertion from defense witness D304496, which cannot undermine the testimony of multiple prosecution witnesses that Abdelrahim died in the attack of 5 December 2013 and was unarmed at the time of his murder. Neither Abakar, given his injuries, nor his mother were engaged in combat when they were killed. In fact, there is no evidence that the Pearl family was part of an armed group. Neither was C-17, who was sheltered at the École de la Liberté when he was killed. The defense suggestion that C-17 was fighting alongside the Seleka when he was killed is not supported by the evidence on the record. Your Honor, that some Muslims from Bosangoa had joined the Seleka does not make all Bosangoa Muslims legitimate targets, as suggested by the defense. Additionally, the general assertion of Muslims in Bosangoa being armed prior to 5 December has no bearing on the civilian status of the approximately 18 victims as specified. In any event, such claims derive mainly from anecdotes and rumor and lack specificity. Your Honors, the evidence shows that the Anti-Balaka who perpetrated this killing were aware of the civilian status of the victim, yet they disregard this status. Your Honors have heard from direct witnesses that the civilian victims were objectively identifiable as such by any onlooker. They were wearing civilian clothes, they were unarmed, some were injured, others were seeking shelter. None of them visibly caused a risk to the attackers. The Anti-Balaka intend to attack the civilian population in Bosangoa on 5 December is further established by the evidence. As Kema, the leader of the attack would later admit to P0287, I quote, "The main objective of his group, the Anti-Balaka in Ouham province, was still to chase all the Muslims out of Ouham and also to chase out all the Seleka," end of quote. P2453 also overheard Anti-Balaka element relay Kema's order to kill all Muslims and leave none alive. P2269, who had also been at Gobere, confirmed, I quote, "We didn't differentiate between Muslim civilian or Seleka. They were all the same. It didn't matter if they were children, women, or elderly. They were all Seleka," end of quote. Contrary to the defense's unfounded allegation, the Anti-Balaka's attack on Muslim civilians in Bosangoa was not justified by any legitimate military objective. Although insider witnesses such as P2251 and P0966 claim that the instruction received by the Anti-Balaka element was to not harm Muslim civilians who did not associate with the Seleka, their testimony demonstrates that in reality, the Anti-Balaka does not distinguish between civilians and combatants. You have heard from P2251's understanding that the large majority of Muslims was associated with the Seleka. In his view, and I quote, "Perhaps 3, 4, or 5 Muslims in each town might not have associated with the Seleka," end of quote. Similarly, P0968 stated that in Bosangoa, and I quote, "Whoever was a Muslim was a Seleka," end of quote. He also added that any Muslim man found in a house who had not fled was a Seleka. Your Honors, the prosecution has established beyond reasonable doubt that the anti-Balaka element also raped at least 2 women in Bosangoa during the attack. The evidence of this rape is credible and reliable. In one instance, 5 anti-Balaka found a Muslim woman hiding in a house. As anti-Balaka is convincing. They were Baya and Sango speaking. They were wearing grigri and red headpieces and were present during a major anti-Balaka offensive. While these 2 rapes are the only ones specified in this case, the evidence shows that sexual violence was symptomatic of the anti-Balaka's wider attack on the town and village of Western Kar. The anti-Balaka raped Muslim in retribution for Seleka's crime. Your Honors, the evidence before you also demonstrates beyond reasonable doubt that in Bosangoa, the anti-Balaka pillage, destroy properties, and attack protected objects. During the attack, Muslim houses were systematically set on fire or otherwise destroyed, especially in the predominantly Muslim neighborhood of Boro, Arab, and Fulbe. In the first week after the attack, the anti-Balaka dismantled and destroyed several mosques, including the Central Mosque of Bosangoa. And by the end of January 2014, they had destroyed at an estimate 1,500 Muslim properties. Your Honors, the evidence further shows that the anti-Balaka's 5th December 2013 attack on Bosangoa caused a mass displacement of Bosangoa Muslim population to the École de la Liberté. There were approximately 7,000 displaced Muslims at the school after the 5th of December. At least 4 prosecution witnesses attested that during the attack, Muslims fled for their lives as the anti-Balaka were shooting everywhere. In addition, the living conditions at the École de la Liberté were so difficult that no one would freely choose to endure them. P2462, P2453, P2652, and P2658's evidence shows that after 5th of December 2013, many people were forced to sleep outside the school building for lack of space. The testimony of these witnesses is corroborated and confirmed by satellite imageries and photographs. The photographs on your screen were taken at the École de la Liberté on 9 December 2013, just few days after the attack and the massive displacement of the Muslim population at the school. As you can see, it was not easy for the displaced Muslim at the school. Contrary to the defense argument, it was impossible for the displaced Muslim to leave the school due to threats of anti-Balaka's attack. The evidence of P2462, P2049, and P2453 shows that this threat was real and it was dangerous to leave the school without military escort. According to P2200, I quote in French, La situation.
The situation for Muslims in Bosangoa at that time was as if one were in a prison. We were surrounded by the anti-Balaka from all angles. They had taken up positions at several locations in the city, and we couldn't dare go out of the camp. A Christian from my neighborhood came and warned us not to step out because the anti-Balaka were tracking down Muslims.
P2200 evidence is corroborated by other contemporaneous evidence, including a video that I will show now. It displays the dire situation of the Muslim in Bosangoa following the 5th December attack by the anti-Balaka.
From power, armed with clubs and machetes, they're known as the anti-Balaka, which means anti-machete in the local Sango language. A few hundred meters from the Christian camp, 7,000 displaced Muslim refugees are living here in a camp set up on the site of a school. They have weapons. I've seen that for myself, she says. They came from the church and they broke everything. They stole everything from my house. The Central African Republic's Muslims and Christians used to live here, together, in relative harmony. Now they've fled for their lives.
Your Honors, ultimately, the Muslim population had no choice but to flee to Chad. By April 2014, virtually the entire Muslim population of Bosangoa had been effectively expelled. Under threats and with no house to return to, they fled mainly to Chad. The removal of the Muslim population was no byproduct of the anti-Balaka's sustained attack against them, but it's very objective. Finally, Your Honors, and contrary to the unfounded allegation made by the defense, the core crime-based witness for the Bosangoa attack, such as 2049, 2200, 2453, 2642, and 2657, gave credible, reliable, and coherent account of the event during the attack and its aftermath. Any inconsistencies in the witness account are reasonable and in most cases relate to minor issues and do not affect their overall credibility. This concludes my presentation on the Bosangoa incident, and tomorrow my colleague will continue with the presentation of the remaining incidents.
Well,
Thank you, Your
that was
Honor.
on the spot, Ms. Makcho. So this concludes the hearing for today. We continue tomorrow morning at 9:30.
All rise, veuillez vous lever.
What have you done? What? We've done, je sais pas.